My parents expected me to fail completely. They even joked and bet on it. I said nothing and kept working, and made sure they lost that bet. The air in the sterile, overly air-conditioned meeting room felt thick enough to chew. It smelled faintly of stale coffee, industrial cleaning fluid, and the palpable tension that only a family torn asunder can generate. My mother, poised rigidly in her chair, her grip on her oversized handbag white-knuckled, looked like she was about to shatter. My father, across the polished mahogany table, had that familiar, tight-lipped sneer, a facial tic I'd come to associate with his absolute refusal to admit defeat. And my brother, David, the golden child, fidgeted beside them, his eyes darting between me and the thick stack of documents Marcus, my lawyer, had just slid across the table. Tone cue. Cold, analytical, it was a masterpiece of forensic accounting, meticulously compiled over years, culminating in this very moment. The moment they lost the bet. All of it. Wait, I'm getting ahead of myself, aren't I? To understand this tableau, this icy snapshot of familial destruction, you need to rewind. You need to understand the foundations, the fertile ground where resentment was carefully sown and nurtured, year after painstaking year. Looking back, that was the first red flag I chose to ignore, that constant, low-frequency hum of dismissal that followed me like a shadow. From as far back as I can remember, I was the odd one out. David, 2 years my senior, was the athlete, the academic, the charismatic charmer. He effortlessly embodied everything my parents valued: conventional success, easy confidence, and an almost irritating ability to blend into any social landscape. Me? I was the quiet one, the one who spent hours tinkering with old electronics in the garage, whose head was always buried in a book about systems or code, whose grades were good but never exceptional in the way David's were. Because I was always off on some tangent, chasing an obscure intellectual rabbit hole. I remember this one Christmas, I must have been 10. David got a brand new, top-of-the-line racing bike. I got a science kit, which, to be clear, I loved. But as I excitedly showed my father the rudimentary circuit I'd built, his eyes weren't really on my creation. They were on David, who was already halfway down the block, a blur of red and chrome. My father, without looking up, just grunted, "That's nice, kiddo. But make sure you don't break anything expensive." Tone cue. Bitter memory. That's how it always was. My efforts, my passions, my very existence were just nice. Never celebrated, never truly seen, always overshadowed by the glittering aura of David, who consistently provided the kind of narcissistic supply my parents craved: external validation, bragging rights, an extension of their own perceived excellence. I was just there. The quiet background hum. The betting started subtly, almost playfully, like a twisted family tradition. My academic choices were questionable, my career aspirations unrealistic. When I decided to pursue a degree in computer science with a focus on entrepreneurial ventures, rather than the safe, corporate law path David had chosen, the jokes began. "Oh, our little innovator," my mother would coo over Sunday dinner, buttering a roll far too aggressively. "Still building those contraptions? You know, the job market is brutal for abstract thinkers, darling." My father would chime in, "Yes, a real leap of faith. David, now he's got a proper career path, partnership track. Stable. You, son, you're playing the lottery." And then David, with a smirk that always sliced a little deeper than their words, would add, "Yeah, remember that online store you tried to start in high school? Lasted a whole 2 months, didn't it?" I remember one particularly scathing Thanksgiving, about 7 years ago. I'd just turned 30. I was still struggling, admittedly. My first real startup had crashed and burned, taking with it most of my savings and a good chunk of my self-esteem. I was back living in a tiny, slightly moldy studio apartment above a noisy restaurant, coding late into the night, nursing a deep, gnawing fear of failure. My parents had cornered me in the kitchen after dinner, the clatter of dishes in the background a jarring counterpoint to their perfectly modulated disdain. So, my mother began, her voice dripping with false concern. "David says you're thinking of another one of your projects." "It's not a project, Mom. It's a proper business plan." I've learned a lot from the last one, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady, despite the tremor in my hands. I'd spent 6 months on this new concept, refining every detail, convinced it was solid. Learned what, exactly? My father interjected, his eyes narrowed. How to lose money faster. Look, we love you, son, but you're just not cut out for this. You're too sensitive. Too much in your head. David, he's got the business acumen. You've always been a dreamer. What if I prove you wrong? I blurted out, the words escaping before I could rein them in. My father actually laughed. A short, dismissive bark. Prove us wrong? About what? That you can make a living doing whatever it is you do. All right then. Tell you what. David and I will put some money on it. 5 years. If you're still afloat, truly afloat, meaning making a comfortable living, supporting yourself without our help, and actually having something tangible to show for it beyond a vague idea, we'll give you a bonus. If not? Well, we'll just say you owe us a very expensive dinner. He winked at David, who snickered. Tone cue, wounded pride, determination, and what exactly is comfortable? I asked, my voice tight. Oh, you'll know, my mother said dismissively, waving a hand. When you're not constantly asking for loans for your seed capital. Fine, I said, my jaw clenching. You're on. 5 years. And we'll define tangible very clearly when the time comes. They scoffed, already convinced they'd won. They didn't know it, but that moment, that casual, cruel dismissal, was the single most powerful motivator I'd ever encountered. It wasn't just about money. It was about reclaiming my narrative, about dismantling the lifelong perception of me as the family failure, the one who never quite measured up to the golden child. It was about proving them wrong, not just to them, but to the younger me who'd always felt so small in their shadow. That night, back in my cramped apartment, the clatter from the restaurant kitchen below echoing my internal turmoil, I pulled out my laptop. The screen flickered, illuminating the peeling paint on the walls. I opened a new document, titled it The Bet, Documentation. I started typing, recounting the conversation word for word. I knew their words would be twisted, forgotten, or gaslight away in the future. So I would document everything. This was the genesis of my forensic descent. The next 5 years were a blur of caffeine, code, and an almost monastic devotion to my work. My new startup wasn't glamorous. It was a niche B2B software solution designed to streamline inventory management for small to medium-sized manufacturing plants. Not the kind of thing that makes headlines, but it solved a genuine problem, and it generated revenue. Slow, steady, compounding revenue. My office was initially just a corner of that studio apartment, the hum of my cheap mini-fridge a constant companion. Later, it was a slightly larger, equally sparse rented space, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow on my perpetually tired face. I lived on instant noodles and the occasional celebratory pizza. My social life dwindled to almost nothing. Every setback, every sleepless night, every client rejection fueled a cold, burning ember of resolve within me. I wasn't just building a company, I was building an airtight case. The forensic deep dive began in earnest, not just for the company, but for them. I kept a meticulous digital trail. Every single financial transaction of the company was logged, categorized, and cross-referenced. Not just for accounting, but for proof. I used a cloud-based accounting system, syncing daily with bank accounts, payment processors, and payroll. Each quarter, I'd export detailed profit and loss statements, balance sheets, and cash flow reports, storing them in a triple redundant system, local hard drive, a secure cloud storage provider, and an encrypted external drive kept in a fireproof safe. The file names were precise: FI 2023_Q3_P and L_final_sign.pdf, FI 2023_annual_audit_report.pdf. I didn't just track the financials. I tracked growth metrics, client acquisition rates, churn rates, average contract value, website traffic, user engagement. I used analytics dashboards to generate weekly and monthly reports, screenshotting key performance indicators, KPIs, and archiving them with corresponding date and timestamps. These weren't just for business. They were exhibits in my future case against their skepticism. I documented every single positive client testimonial, every successful implementation story, every glowing review. These weren't just marketing materials. They were evidence of real value, real success, tangible proof. The physical environment during this period became an extension of my obsessive documentation. My small office, barely large enough for a desk and a couple of filing cabinets, became a fortress of data. The desktop PC, custom-built for speed and storage, whirred almost continuously, its fans a rhythmic pulse in the quiet room. I had a second monitor dedicated solely to my bet folder, a constantly open window displaying a complex spreadsheet, charting my progress against their vague definition of comfortable living. Every time a new client signed, a new milestone was reached, a new contract secured, I'd update it, a quiet, almost ritualistic act of defiance. The clicking of the keyboard at 3 a.m. became my lullaby. The faint scent of ozone from the overworked server rack was the smell of victory in the making. But the real forensic work wasn't just about my success, it was about their words. Remember that Thanksgiving conversation? I'd typed it out that very night. But words could be denied. Gaslighting was their forte. I needed more. The next time my father made a similar dismissive comment about my hobby over the phone, I'd discreetly hit record on my phone. Tone cue, calculated, almost robotic. I developed a habit of doing this, not for every conversation, but for the ones that veered into belittlement or the bet. Sometimes it was a voice note, sometimes a transcript from a video call. I kept these recordings under strict encryption, categorized by date, time, and topic. Dad_bet_18_2020.mp3. Mom_doubt_December_25_2021.txt. A chilling digital diary of their insidious psychological warfare. One particularly frustrating conversation happened over email after I'd mentioned signing a surprisingly large client. My mother had replied, "That's wonderful, dear, but do be careful. These things can be fleeting. Remember what your father said about that bet we had? Don't count your chickens." I screenshot that email immediately, printing it out and filing it alongside its digital counterpart. This wasn't just my growth. This was their consistent, relentless belief in my inevitable failure, their sunk cost fallacy playing out in real time. They had invested so much in the narrative of my inadequacy that they couldn't acknowledge any evidence to the contrary. It would dismantle their entire framework. For years the company was profitable, growing, and had a small but dedicated team. I wasn't rich, but I was undeniably comfortable, self-sufficient, and building significant equity. It was far beyond their vague definition. That's when I found Marcus. A referral from a former colleague. Marcus was a corporate lawyer specializing in tech, but with a reputation for being fiercely pragmatic and, as I quickly learned, utterly cynical about human nature. He had a permanent 5 o'clock shadow and eyes that seemed to have witnessed every possible permutation of human avarice and deceit. I laid out my entire story, not just the business success, but the family dynamics, the bet, the recordings, the emails, the constant erosion of my self-worth. I expected him to dismiss it as a petty family feud. Instead, he leaned back in his leather chair, a slow, knowing smile spreading across his face. "So, you're not just building a business," Marcus drawled, swirling the ice in his glass of water. "You're building a case. A psychological one, disguised as a financial one." "Exactly," I said, feeling a surge of validation. "I want them to understand the full weight of what they did and what they've lost." "And what exactly do you want to achieve with this bet?" he asked, eyes sharp. "Beyond the satisfaction, of course, which, believe me, I understand completely. I want them to acknowledge it," I said, the words feeling inadequate. "And I want them to pay up. Not just the principal amount, but what it's worth now, considering the emotional damages, the interest of my success, and the sheer audacity of their certainty." Marcus chuckled. Emotional damages. That's a fun one with family. But the bet itself? If you can prove they made it, and you've quantified your success beyond a shadow of a doubt, well, that's a contract, however informal. We can assign a value to their bonus amount, Factor in inflation and maybe even punitive interest for the years of, shall we say, negative reinforcement. Over the next 6 months, Marcus and his junior associate helped me refine my evidence. They reviewed every financial report, every growth metric, every archived communication. He introduced me to an independent business valuation expert who put a robust figure on my company's worth and my personal income. The expert's report, a thick, bound document, detailed revenue growth, market position, and projected earnings. It was ironclad. Marcus even helped me transcribe and authenticate the audio recordings, ensuring they'd stand up as evidence of their agreement to the bet. He found an old email from my father to David, casually mentioning your brother's little gamble, further cementing the parental buy-in to their sick game. It wasn't just my records anymore. It was third-party validation, an unassailable mountain of proof. The day came. The end of the 5-year period. I'd sent them a formal letter, drafted by Marcus, inviting them to a settlement meeting. They were bewildered, then annoyed, then indignant. They thought I was asking for money again. They arrived with David, who, true to his nature, looked smug, clearly expecting to witness another of my humiliating failures, another demonstration of my inability to be like him. The meeting room. The sterile smell. The tension. Marcus, impassive, began. He walked them through the valuation report, the profit and loss statements, the growth metrics. He projected charts and graphs onto the wall, showing an undeniable upward trajectory. He detailed my personal income, my equity in the company, the undeniable fact that I was not just comfortable, but thriving. Their faces, initially dismissive, slowly morphed. My mother's eyes widened, then narrowed in disbelief. My father's sneer faltered, replaced by a deep furrow in his brow. David's smugness evaporated, replaced by a sullen envy. "This is ridiculous," my mother finally sputtered, her voice higher than usual. "He just got lucky. This is not what we meant by the bet." Tone cue. Barely contained rage. "Oh really, Mom?" I interjected, my voice dangerously calm. "Because I have a recording of Dad, from Thanksgiving 5 years ago, explicitly stating the terms. If you're still afloat, truly afloat, meaning making a comfortable living, supporting yourself without our help, and actually having something tangible to show for it beyond a vague idea. Sound familiar?" I nodded to Marcus. He clicked a button on a remote. The clear, unmistakable sound of my father's voice filled the room, replaying his words from that Thanksgiving dinner, followed by David's snicker. The air crackled. My parents flinched as if physically struck. David's face went crimson. And then, Marcus continued, "We have this email from Mrs., my last name, herself, cautioning our client not to count his chickens and reminding him of the bet. As if his success was a temporary anomaly, a statistical fluke." He projected the screenshot of her email onto the wall. "This is gaslighting, plain and simple," Marcus stated, his voice flat, emotionless. "The constant attempts to diminish his achievements, to deny the very terms you yourselves set. Your consistent pattern of behavior created an environment of reactive abuse, forcing our client to not just succeed, but to meticulously document that success as a defense mechanism against your inevitable denial." My mother started to cry, a performative, theatrical sob. "How could you do this to us? Your own family." My father, ever the pragmatist when cornered, tried a different tack. "All right, fine. So you succeeded. Good for you. But this bet was a joke. A bit of fun. There was no actual money on the line." Tone cue, ICO. "But there was, Dad," I said, leaning forward. "You offered a bonus. And Marcus and I have calculated what that bonus is worth, given 5 years of compounding interest, the emotional toll, and the market value of your initial investment in my failure. It's a significant sum. Plus, the expert valuation of my company, which I suspect far exceeds what you and David currently control. The joke is that you bet against me, publicly, consistently, for decades, and now you have to pay. Not just financially, but by staring your own biased perception of me directly in the face." Marcus then presented the final document, a demand for payment. It wasn't just a simple sum. It represented their total loss, Not just of the bet, but of any moral high ground, any semblance of a loving, supportive parental role. It was a cold, hard, legal reckoning. They eventually settled, out of court, because Marcus had built an unassailable case. The amount was substantial. A truly uncomfortable living indeed. But the money, while satisfying, felt hollow. The silence that followed, the complete severing of ties, was profound. There were no grand apologies, no heartfelt admissions of guilt. Just an ingrained bitterness from their side, a festering wound on mine. Tone cue. Reflective, weary, so I won. I proved them wrong. I dismantled their narrative of my failure, piece by painstaking piece, with forensic precision. But the cost? It was immense. I lost my family, or rather, I finally acknowledged that I never truly had the kind of family I deserved. The constant pressure, the endless need to prove myself, honed me into an entrepreneur, yes, but it also carved out a part of my soul. The victory felt less like champagne and more like a quiet, chilly sunrise. It wasn't the triumphant roar I'd imagined, but a weary exhale. I know what you're thinking. Was it worth it? To expose them, to break the bonds entirely, to walk away with a financial victory, but an emotional desert? Should I have just let it go, built my life in peace, and accepted that some people will never change? Or was this necessary? Was this the only way to escape the shadow of the golden child dynamic, to break free from the cycle of reactive abuse, and finally stand on my own ground, truly seen, truly valued, even if only by myself? What do you think, Reddit? Am I the asshole for collecting on a bet they never thought I'd win? Or was this the only way to finally win my freedom?